money everywhere.
So like, even just my brain on the world. Yeah. Oh, for sure.
But I learned a lot, and it was, you know, and it was.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As you all are probably aware, it's a bit crazy around here this weekend with homecoming. So that was exciting. And to be honest, we're celebrating a little bit of a homecoming here today for our guest who's giving today's colloquium, as well as the environmental policy lecture on Wednesday here at 2 p.m. So if you can make it, that would be wonderful. It will also be streamed. But I'd like to introduce Aseem Prakash from the University of Washington. He received his PhD here in at what is now the O'Neill School, but what was SPIA. And so we are delighted to have him back. He studied with Lynn and Vincent when he was here, as did his partner Nives, and they will Nives Solsek, and she will actually be giving a lecture at the O'Neill School on Thursday at noon. I believe that's right. And so we are so delighted to have them both back here at the workshop today. Professor Prakash has published, frankly, far too many papers and books and chapters to really explain here, but his work really focuses on environmental governance, voluntary regulation, NGOs, and climate change. And he really does sort of both, as you can tell, a large amount of academic publishing, but also some public intellectual work as well, publishing lots and lots of op-eds along questions of climate governance. I don't even know, I could go on for a very long time, but I'd really like to have a wonderful conversation about the paper today, which will be about public support for the Thacker Pass lithium mine in Nevada, which is actually also something that's very close to my heart. So I'm very excited about this paper. And let's see, is there anything else I should say? Oh, if it's okay to share this as a fun fact, actually, Aseem and Nives got married here at the workshop. Really special moment for us to have them back here and to celebrate. So we are really, really excited to have them here. I think I'll leave it at that. I will just briefly say, just a recollection of the ground rules, right? I will keep a queue, both of the folks online. Welcome, thanks for joining us, you guys, but also in person. For folks online, it'd be really helpful. Either you can use the raise hand function or even just in the chat. And I will try to keep track of all of that. Just really quickly, are you okay with clarifying questions in the midst of it? Okay, so clarifying questions in the midst of presentation, but let's hold all other kinds of inquiries until the end. So I will leave it at that and just say welcome. And again, we're so glad to have you here, Professor Prakash.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me pull up the PowerPoint here. You want me to control? Can you just tell me when to go, or do you want to do it? Make it easier for you to do it. Go.
Thank you.
Share screen.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Thank you. I'll do that first. Before reminding me. That's here, right? Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Other side for the introduction. Yeah.
Can you go to the presenter?
Yeah, go to the presenter mode.
This.
Slideshow.
Oh, this might automatically play it, right? We'll let you.
Perfect. Thank you. So I arrived in Bloomington in 1993. So that makes me a 29th year student of the workshop. So, yeah, 30. Almost 30. Almost 30. And it's very interesting to come back the place where you got your PhD and you got married. Actually, we got married at those stairs as you come down with Lynn and Vincent presiding over our marriage. And then we had a reception in IMU, and Harmeet's wife, Myung, played the piano, if you recall. So Nives and I, as we were driving in yesterday, And I remember Jim and his wife joining us at the reception. And Michael McGuinness was on my dissertation committee. So anything I say which is not up to the mark, the blame is on him.
Your memory is better than ours.
I did have a few co-conspirators on the committee. I might deflect responsibility.
Right, but you know,
Yeah, maybe.
joint and several, that's the. So it's lovely to be back. So we are talking about decarbonization and supply chains, public support for Thacker Pass lithium mine. It's a very important issue in climate justice, and Sanya is here, one of the authorities on climate justice. So thank you, Sanya, for joining us. And we are doing this paper, in fact, series of papers with two colleagues in Japan. So we are looking at different aspects of climate justice, and I'm going to define what climate justice is. We're doing a couple of papers on migration, because an argument is being made that climate-induced migration is a form of adaptation. And migration itself creates different kinds of problems. Of course, people who have to migrate, it's extremely stressful and costly for them. But also the areas that receive migration, migrants, have their own political issues. As we've seen in the United States, we've seen in Latin America, actually we've seen in different parts of the world, including Mexico, including Venezuela. So we are going to talk about the broader issue of climate justice and specifically talk about who picks up the cost of climate transition, which is an issue that needs a bit more discussion and research because it's been neglected from the policy discussions. So I think everybody believes climate change is a very serious problem. And to borrow Christopher Clark's phrase, we are kind of sleepwalking into a disaster. This kind of virtuous signaling going on, but nobody really wants to pick up the tab, at least not the way they should. And the Ukrainian invasion is a very good invasion that everybody wants to be passing the buck. So it's a very sorry state of affairs because it is a very serious problem. And one of the major contributors of the climate challenge is the transportation sector. So globally, it's about 30% of carbon emissions are attributed to the transportation sector. In the United States, it's slightly less, but typically one would say between 1/4 to 1/3 of total emissions are from the transportation sector. And the argument is that if you were to decarbonize the transportation sector, electrify it, and make sure that the electricity that is generated is also from renewable sources, electricity generation is another 25%. Then we would have made important progress in tackling the climate challenge. The issue is that decarbonization technologies as of now, which is essentially electric vehicle batteries, they require something called lithium. They require cobalt and other things as well, what are called critical minerals, but lithium is a very important component. So there's a massive increase in global demand for lithium, including the United States. And as of now, United States has got only one lithium mine. So lithium is mined in South America, Australia, what's called the lithium triangle, and a couple of other places. And critical minerals like cobalt are mined in Congo, but refined in China. So it's become a very important issue. In the United States, it is kind of racing ahead towards decarbonization of the transportation sector, but we don't have a domestic supply infrastructure. An architecture of supply in the domestic economy is missing, which means we are very vulnerable to international pressures. Take the case of nickel. One of the major suppliers of battery grade nickel is Nordnickel, a Russian company. And if tomorrow Nordnickel decides that it's going to curtail the supply of nickel, decarbonization is going to take a huge, huge hit. And of course, with the rising tension in China and China's control over the supply chain, this is a very serious issue. And interestingly, it's one of the few areas where both Democrats and Republicans agree on that we have to kind of domesticize or indigenize our supply chain for electric vehicles, specifically critical minerals. Republicans don't like to use the term climate change, so they'll say for national security needs. But the bottom line is we need more lithium. The United States has got only one lithium mine. So one of the prime candidates for opening up a new mine is something called Thacker Pass. It's in Nevada. These are the pictures, Humboldt County. And the proposed mine is supposed to be so massive that it could actually generate enough lithium to satisfy 1/4 of global lithium demand. Of course, it depends how you estimate the demand, how many EVs would be sold, would be able to find a non-lithium based battery. So there are a lot of assumptions, but the point I'm trying to make is this mine is of a sufficient scale to make a non-trivial impact on the global lithium shortage. So it's something we have to very seriously contend with. So the question we ask, and I'm motivated by theory in a minute, that does the physical proximity to this mine influence the support for mining? Sometimes called NIMBY, not very correctly so, but that's the logic. That I incur private costs to create a public good, and I don't like that. There's a reaction to that. And second, it's not only proximity to the Thacker Pass mine. In the state of Nevada, there are 165 mines. If I live near any other mine, I actually know the pros and cons of mining. Would my prior experience to mines influence my support for Thacker Pass? And third, it's a survey experiment, so we add an experimental component. Because when people are thinking about Thacker Pass, it depends how the narrative is shaped. So we test 3 narratives. One is going to provide a global public good. That means it's going to help global warming, which is a global public good. Of course, with local spillovers, but predominantly it's a global public good. Second is going to help national defense, the China threat. And we clearly mentioned China in our survey experiment. So that's a national level public good. And third is a local public good. It would help local jobs, support local government by creating more revenue. So there are 3 kinds of public goods at different scales: global, national, local. And we are asking people who are living next to Thacker Pass or not so physical proximity to Thacker Pass, or exposed to any other mines, and we test them separately. How do they think of what is the level of support for Thacker Pass? What's the theoretical motivation? If we look at the literature on environmental justice, it really started in the 1970s. Bullard was one of the pioneers, and essentially waste incineration facilities were being located or were found in areas predominantly inhabited by low-income people, people of color. So that led to the environmental justice movement, and it was a very powerful movement and a very, very justifiable movement, because certain people, because of their demographic characteristics, are bearing the burdens of industrial processes. But environmental justice or justice issues are not only limited to incineration facilities. It could be waste dumps, it could be mines, it could be quarrying. There are a lot of what we call locally induced public bans or locally undesirable facilities. And the idea is, where are they located? Why are they located? There's obviously a causality issue. So one is that you deliberately locate the facility in areas inhabited by people with certain demographics. So here, there's a very purposive location. Other is you locate a facility because it's so terrible, land values go down, and then people move in. So causality is different. One is very purposive, one is not purposive. But at the end of the day, one looks at substantive impact, one sees that people with certain characteristics, groups with certain characteristics, are suffering disproportionate negative externalities. So this is the history of environmental justice, and people have taken this idea and applied to climate justice. That climate change is going to affect poor people and underprivileged people. Different countries have different kinds of underprivileged people more than others. So for example, poor people tend to live in areas which are next to water bodies, which are low-lying areas across the world. It's not only a US problem, it's across the world. So there is rain, there's waterlogging, these people suffer the worst. Or poor people are living in small houses which are not well protected. There's a hurricane, these are the first houses to blow up. These are the first houses to get destroyed, etc., etc. So I can go on and on. The fact is, the extreme weather events induced by climate change are going to have a disproportionate impact on underprivileged people, people who don't have power across the world. But this is not the only story. What Nevis and I have suggested in a recent article in Annual Review, 3 Faces of Climate Justice, there are two other justice dimensions. One is who picks up the cost of climate action? So suppose we all decide that, okay, climate change is horrible, terrible, we have to do something, let's impose a carbon tax. Not every group is going to be equally affected by carbon tax. In fact, this is a huge political issue. In the state of Washington, which is a blue state, we have voted down a carbon tax twice and by a very substantial margin, 43% to 57%. And the reason is that poor people tend to spend a higher proportion of their household budgets on energy costs. So if you impose a carbon tax, it's these communities that are going to get hurt, unless until you have a mechanism to compensate them, the whole revenue recycling debate. Or you look at cap and trade. So now there is a very important school of thought that says California's cap and trade has actually increased pollution in less privileged communities. Because as the companies were forced to cut down and cap, they consolidated pollution in specific facilities. And these facilities tend to be located in poorer areas. And there are different mechanisms for why poor people are getting disproportionately hurt. And one is that they don't have so much of political power. They don't have the network of social organizations because organizing NGOs or nonprofits requires resources. Poor people are doing two jobs, they don't have the resources. The typical problem with PTAs, parent-teacher associations, is essentially populated by middle and upper middle class. The poor people don't have the time to attend PTA meetings or volunteer their time. They're busy doing two jobs. So I think this is a very important issue that climate action, even if we undertake, it is imposing costs in different ways. Or we strengthen zoning laws. That means housing becomes scarce, so poor people are kind of priced out. Or we have new building codes. That means the cost of housing rises, so poor people can't build houses. So these are unintended consequences. The idea was not to hurt people, but when you enact a policy, there are benefits and costs. And the climate movement, I suspect, is not adequately talking about the costs of climate policy. We're only talking about benefits. But there are winners and losers. That doesn't mean the policy is bad. It means we need a compensating mechanism. We need a mechanism to make sure that it is more equitable. Of course, there's no nirvana policy. And policies will always have a level of injustice, but at least we should recognize there's a problem and then try to solve it to the extent as possible. And the third is the uneven distribution of benefits of climate action. So, we all love electric vehicles. In fact, Nevis and I have a plug-in hybrid. We get 30, 35 miles a gallon. We can go to the university and back on a battery charge. It's lovely. But not everybody can afford to buy hybrids or to buy plug-ins or to buy electric vehicles or solar panels. I'm not talking about utility scale, but distributed. That means what we put on the house tops. So to have solar panels on your rooftop, you must be owning a house. So what about renters? People who don't own houses. Or people who own houses but are too poor because they're struggling to meet their bills. There is an upfront cost required in installing solar panels. So the benefits of climate action are also unevenly distributed. So we have three faces of climate justice, not one. And if we want to generate a greater level of public support for real climate action, we have to talk about and hopefully address all three. So in this paper, we are really talking about uneven distribution of costs of climate action. So climate action is good. We all want that. But even this good action creates negative externalities that are disproportionately affecting different groups. So here are some examples. In Indiana, it's a red state, but it's really gung-ho on wind. I think Sanya is doing some excellent work on that. And local counties, a large number of local counties has enacted laws that are restricting solar and wind. In fact, Nevis and I are doing a paper with a student of ours. We are looking at onset of restricted regulations all over the US. More than 150 counties have enacted regulations restricting solar and wind. One of our students is doing the same thing in South Korea. Rural areas don't want, for reasons of aesthetics, property values, X, Y, or Z, solar and wind. Some do, some don't. But in Indiana, there's a backlash. So local counties are pushing back. And the state assembly, I don't think they quite passed that bill. It failed in the Senate, in the upper chamber, passed the lower chamber. They were trying to enact a law that would disallow counties to restrict solar and wind. And this is happening in a red state. So in some ways, climate politics or climate policy, if we take the labels out, actually is a very interesting phenomenon. Local backlash, but state level, the government is saying it's economic development. It's not climate. Or think about the big controversy over electricity from Quebec Hydro. Quebec has a lot of hydro. They want to send it to eastern states, specifically New York. It has to go through Maine, and Maine has, a referendum said we don't want these electricity lines. Why should we tolerate these high voltage transmission lines to feed New York? A lot of litigation also going on. The native nations in Quebec are saying, well, these lines are affecting some of our traditional areas. So Native Americans in Quebec are opposing it. So these communities, whether it's Maine, whether it's native communities in Quebec, are opposing hydro, which could help Winaway, New York, which is highly, highly dependent on coal from fossil fuels. And solar farms in our beautiful state of Washington, we have very little solar. And one of the reasons is there's massive pushback against solar farms by rural areas. So in some ways, it could be becoming a rural-urban conflict because electricity is consumed in urban areas and it's generated in rural areas. And EVs and lithium mine comes in because without power, the EV revolution will not take off. You're just replacing fuel at the gasoline stage by coal at the burning stage. So there is a massive mobilization against Thacker Pass. And of course, it's local people. A lot of people have come from other states. And when one goes through local news and tries to have a conversation with some people who are involved, it's very interesting the kind of arguments they're making. So we just picked up two. That environmentalists might be confused about why we want to interfere with the production of electric cars, but it's wrong to destroy a mountain for any reason. So this is, strict environmentalism, what you call hard environmentalism. Or they're talking about intergenerational conflict. So the narrative that is being used for climate change is being used essentially to stop the lithium mine. So how to understand this opposition? So the lens people have often used, and it's a highly problematic lens, is NIMBY, not in my backyard. And essentially the literature arose because there is a bad facility coming up in your backyard and local people mobilize against it because they think we are bearing the cost, although it's generating public. So why should I pick up the tab? That was NIMBY, not in my backyard. So it has a very specific scope condition if you use the phrase NIMBY. And of course, the costs are of different kinds. It could be externalities in terms of health, it could be property values, it could be aesthetics. There are a range of costs, and different people have different costs. Or there could be some procedural injustice, where people are really mad that they were not consulted and the policy was imposed on them. So there's substantive issues, procedural issues, but essentially this is the notion of costs in the vast NIMBY literature. But alongside, there's something called YIMBY, yes, in my backyard. And these communities are saying, we are happy to have a plant in our backyard. My colleague Rebecca Thorpe has documented how in American South, there is a huge support for prisons because prisons are a big source of local employment. And she's even said that the anti-crime, tough on crime, all these legislations in Congress, you get higher votes from legislators who are representing deep South, rural areas, not urban areas. Or nuclear plants, we have a paper where we actually find that support in Japan for restarting nuclear plants in the wake of Fukushima is higher when the nuclear plant is generating local jobs. So people are saying we are okay with the nuclear plant. So this is YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, because people want local jobs. And their risk perception, it's a question of risk perceptions, how people are thinking of benefits and costs. They don't think it's that risky. They've lived next to it. So I often psych my students in Seattle, and people are gung-ho, we hate nuclear, and we can't have nuclear. I said, do you realize 25% of nuclear weapons in the United States of America are within 25 miles of Seattle? because Bainbridge Island and Everett is hosting nuclear submarines and nuclear power aircraft carriers. So we are within 25 miles of major nuclear plants, because essentially what you have in an aircraft carrier is a nuclear plant. It's not commercial scale. Same with people in San Diego. They don't realize they're living next to lots of nuclear plants. So sometimes it's a question of perceptions. You don't think of military as a nuclear power plant operator, but it has an impeccable record when you think of nuclear. And Nevis is going to talk about nuclear tomorrow on Thursday. So not preempt.
See, if I can just interrupt, I don't know, I'd love to have enough time for good discussion. If we can get 2 results in maybe 5 minutes, is that?
Yeah,
right?
I will. Yeah,
Oh,
sure.
great. Okay.
I will run through it. So we essentially looked at residents of Nevada. It's a survey experiment. And we look at 2 measures of geography: proximity to Thacker Pass. We ask individuals what their zip code is and try to see the distance between zip code and Thacker Pass. And second, we geocode every individual on their proximity to 165 miles. Because when people say local costs, local is very arbitrary. We don't know what is local. Is it 5 miles, 10 miles, 20 miles? So we think we'll actually take a measure of physical distance. And we create a measure of exposure to all Nevada lines, take the inverse of all distances, and take the actual distance to Thacker Pass. Then we divide the sample into 4 groups: reference, category, and 3 treatment frames, and we expose them to 3 treatments. So let me go to the findings. So we actually find some support for YIMBY, that if you're living closer to Thacker Pass, you are slightly more statistically significant support of Thacker Pass. And exposure to existing mines does not have a statistical significance. So which is very interesting, that people who are living close to Thacker Pass probably have done their own benefit and cost analysis. Maybe the policy salience is low, and they don't think it's such a big deal. And even if you're living next to mines, you've seen the pollution, you've seen the negatives, you still think the benefits outweigh the costs, or it is not statistically significant. And what is amazing, or maybe it's not that amazing, that when it comes to the national security, the 3 frames: climate frame, national security, local development, national security frame has the maximum traction. It's a national level public good. So we can't take a very, very what I call hard collective action kind of argument that why would individuals be willing to encourage private costs to provide a public good, because it's a national level public good. But apparently the threat perception of China is sufficiently high among sufficient number of people that this frame actually has some salience. And in terms of individual attributes, people who think environment should be prioritized over national, over economic growth, positive, which is interesting. Environmentalists are actually supporting Thacker Pass. More educated people support Thacker Pass, which is again interesting. Women and older people have a negative coefficient, which is again, consistent with the literature that women and people in a different demographic category are less risk prone. So maybe it's a risk response to risk, etc. Duration of stay in Nevada. So, you may be a newcomer, just arrived yesterday. You've really not appreciated the pros and cons of living next to a mine versus the duration of stay. So people who have stayed longer actually have a negative perception of show negative support for Thacker Pass. What we surprised was Republicans and independents with Democrats as the reference category. Actually, the coefficient is negative. They are not supportive of Thacker Pass. So this is something we couldn't understand why it was. So to conclude, that one looks at the Pew polls or the Gallup polls, and everybody is saying there's very high level support for climate action. And Nevis and I have written extensively of that these polls are actually quite wrong. Because when you ask people, do you support climate action? People will say yes. But if you ask them, okay, are you willing to incur a tax to support climate action? The ballgame changes. So in some ways, it's virtue signaling if you're not picking the tab, but if you ask them to pick the tab, it is the dynamics change. Second, I think instead of asking about climate change per se, I think now the research should talk about specific climate issues, because climate issues are sufficiently different. And they have a different political dynamics in terms of, normative appeal, in terms of benefits and costs for different groups. And the China threat is real. So it seems. So one could say it's the onset of a second Cold War. And there's a deliberate construction of the China threat. There is a lot of articles in something called the China shock, that counties that have been devastated by manufacturing, loss of jobs, tend to vote more Republican, et cetera, et cetera. So unemployment, economic turmoil is associated with a voter shift, especially amongst the working class. So the whole China syndrome is there in politics. And I don't think, or Nevis and I don't think we've adequately understood in terms of how the rise of China is affecting domestic politics and public opinion about important policy issues. We undertook the survey in the last week of February and the first week of March, and that is when Putin invaded Ukraine. So it is very much possible that our survey got affected. Suddenly there was an energy crisis and people realized the importance of decarbonization. So hopefully, after the Ukraine crisis has been settled, if it ever gets settled, or at least gets down in policy salience, we'd like to repeat the survey. So what this is an artifact of the Ukraine invasion. And then I think the issue is the China frame had high resonance for mining because China is a very important actor in critical mining. But when we come to renewable energy, siting of solar or wind farms, is the China threat a compelling narrative? Because it's quite a bit removed in terms of citing a particular renewable facility. So this is something which is to be empirically tested. But when we think of the mechanisms, probably not. I think there are local issues might become more important. But to end, we have to ask who is going to bear the cost of climate action. There's a well-developed literature in just transition. A lot of people used to say, well, if you're talking just transition, blah, 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 blah. Nevis and I wrote a piece in 2016 about Hillary Clinton's plan on Appalachia. After she made that famous statement on baskets of deplorable, she wanted to kind of mitigate that harm. So she laid out a plan for Appalachia. And Nevis and I wrote a piece in Washington Post, and apparently it was so popular, it got republished after a couple of months. And where we said, this is really an issue of just transition. That people who are disaffected by what is called liberal politics, and climate politics is liberal politics, and they feel they're bearing the cost, whether it's rural Indiana, whether it's Appalachia, whether X, Y, or Z, that cost of climate action has to be addressed. Whether it's through compensation, whether it's through X, Y, or Z, I think there are a range of policy instruments, but we have to start talking not only about benefits of climate action, but also costs of climate action. And unless until we talk about costs in a meaningful way, we will continue to receive less support for climate action, climate policies, as we have received in the past.
Okay, wonderful. So we're going to open up for conversation. I'm going to stop sharing screen just so that we can make sure that we can see. Okay, great. And so I think our first question was from Sonia and then Mike, and then I will keep the queue from there. I'll also keep an eye on the online chat.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. That was excellent. A quick clarifying question and then a slightly bigger question. Clarifying question is, for the framing, you had 3 frames. Did you also have a no frame for a comparison? And then the more substantive question is, in thinking about the 3 faces of climate injustice, is there a 4th face, and that is procedure and who's involved in making decisions and leading when it comes to the climate futures? And then can we translate that into this study? Did you ask a question by chance about how much one feels that they are allowed to participate or have participated in the past or have agency or leadership or anything along those lines?
Excellent. Yeah. So there was a reference frame and these are the 3 treatment frames. So when we run the regression, the reference frame, but we only have the dummies for the treatment frames. So in the paper, the annual review paper, Nevis and I said that we are only looking at substantive climate justice. And you're right, there's a procedural aspect as well. And a lot of times people are mad because they feel they have not been consulted properly. And they're being kind of cut out of the process. So you're right, that's the fourth phase of climate justice, the procedural injustice. And that applies to all the three phases. In all three phases, when policy action is taken without public input. And I think that's why the Ostrom school of thought is important. Because you can get input through different ways. Town hall is one, but it's a bottom-up process where local level decisions get aggregated up. So that's another way to ensure there's less procedural injustice. So I think your point is well taken. That's the fourth phase.
And do you have variables that can?
We don't have variables in this paper, but I think that's it's a separate new paper. And which is important in its own ways, because James and I were chatting yesterday, actually with Jessica. Most of the climate policy now is very structural. In fact, most of the political discussions are about structure. Whether we talk about structural injustice, structural racism, structural this, structural that. Very few are about agency. It's a very non-Ostrom phase of US politics. And when Nevis and I have talked about agency in the context of climate change, we have received a lot of pushback. So for example, if we say that, if you're a climate person, maybe fly less. We're not saying stop flying, but fly less. Or maybe don't drive an SUV. Maybe it's not a good idea. There are fuel efficient cars. We're doing some work on meat consumption. Maybe eat meat, but don't eat beef, or eat less. Substitute for chicken, use chicken, or even if you don't want to go beyond burgers or fake meat. So we can do some changes, and there are two kinds of pushback we get. One is that anybody who talks of agency is a climate denier. Michael Mann makes that argument that anybody who talks about individual responsibility is a climate denier, because that's soft denial. Everything is structural. And the malefactor is a fossil fuel. So that's a lot of argument is there. How dare you talk about individual responsibility? You're a climate denier. And second is what they call the I frame versus the S frame, that individual actions, eating less burgers is not going to make a difference. I'm still going to fly wherever I want. I want to, do whatever. I'm not the problem. Problem lies somewhere else. So this is very different. I always think, how would Vincent have a conversation, his paper on artisans, and all of us are artisans, and we're creating our own systems of governance. No matter what the scale, and eventually, the scale aggregates and bubbles up. So that's very important. But that conversation is completely lost. And I think one of the contributions the Ostrom workshop can make is bringing agency back in climate conversations. We've lost it. And agency doesn't mean individual. Agency is exercised at different levels. But expecting the federal government will take care of everything is practically difficult and leads to different kinds of problems. But this is the conversation we ought to have, but we are not having, at least not to the extent we should.
Thank you. Mike was next, and then Dan.
Aseem, good presentation. Good to have a chance to ask you some questions about your work again. It's been a few decades. I was struck reading your paper and your presentation in a little different way, but I think it's the same issue. In your presentation, you talked about the national security concerns. When that was the treatment that you used, the national security treatment, you increased the public support. But then when you looked at the attributes, the Republicans and independents, and especially the Republicans, were actually less supportive of this project. And I'm kind of surprised because national security is often associated with Republicans. So I guess I'm curious about what was in the treatment for the national security. Did you talk at all about the national economy parts of it, or which would be supportive of the same way? Or did you start to talk in terms of, this is important for building the economy so that we can build up the green economy and all that? And because any sort of statement of that would sort of undermine the positive side for the Republicans. And you have a great example in your paper about in Indiana. There was this governor made this great a statement about this great support for this new wind farm being put up or something, and said this is great for jobs, and didn't say a word about climate change or contributing to that. It was all about the jobs. It had nothing to do with the environment. So he knows how to speak to his base, right? He talks about he talks about jobs. He doesn't talk about the effects on climate. So would there be a way to get a little different interventions so that you could give some of the people the national security plus the national economy component, and then others the national security plus the climate component, and see if you get different responses to those combinations? Because the three public goods are really not all public goods. Sometimes what one sees as a public good, if you're talking here to a climate audience primarily, right? So everyone sees the climate as a public good. But for people coming from a Republican point of view, any mention of climate is kind of a bad. And it sort of attracts from that. So that it's not so clear these are three independent levels of public goods, but they're sort of mixed bags of combinations of public and partisan discomfort. Sorry.
Right. So what you're talking is an interaction effect.
Yeah.
Right. So we didn't interact party identification with the frames. We could. So what we are reporting is the unconditional treatment. So that includes people who are exposed to any frame, including the treatment frames. And overall, we find a support for national security frame. Climate frame actually has a negative coefficient. It's not statistically significant, but the coefficient is negative. And the economy frame, the coefficient is positive, but it doesn't achieve statistical significance. So we don't highlight it. So it is possible, and I think we can do that, to interact Republicans with the three frames and then see if the dynamics are slightly different. And maybe, what you're suggesting makes a lot of intuitive sense. Republicans are strong on national security. But it's interesting. If Democrats are in power, the national security perspective of Republicans changes. So see the support for Putin in Ukraine war. Opinion polls after opinion polls suggest there is actually a partisan divide. So I think national security and how different political parties think of national security is often dependent on who's controlling the White House. But you're right. Overall, Republicans are supposed to be strong on national security.
And just a follow-up point on that, your observation that this happened right during the Ukrainian invasion was, I think, a really good sort of thing to sort of consider and compare to later sort of resolved. But I'm not sure if that was primarily a national security intervention or a energy policy sort of intervention, because that could cut different ways. It could intensify the national security concerns of being dependent on the other big autocrat, the Chinese, or it could be, well, it's okay, we didn't really want this stuff to fight the environment, the climate change anyway, because it doesn't exist. I mean, so it could cut both ways.
Right. So I unfortunately don't have my survey here, but the national security frame was essentially about electrification and control of China over supply chains. And oftentimes in the discussion, they're talking about Russia, and China is also coming up. That okay, because that's also the time when China started doing its military drills around Taiwan.
That's right.
United States sent a career force. So China had also suddenly become, and the fear was China might want to do a Ukraine on Taiwan, just grab it and see, okay, let's see what they can do. And one of the arguments that was made, I don't know if it's true or false, one reason United States started to take such a muscular stand on Ukraine was essentially signaling to China that, okay, we're still there, we will still fight. So we don't know, but it did raise the issue of national security and the salience of national security. So it may not be China only, but national security rose in public salience. And what we think is potentially it may have rubbed off on the survey. So if one does this survey when national security is less, high on public salience, we may get differences. It would be lovely if we get the same results. If we don't, we can understand it.
All right, I think next we have Dan, then Gustavo, then Shannon, then Brian.
Yes, a couple of different related questions. We're seeing increasing use of trade restrictions on both lithium, extracted lithium, and battery production, not just in China, but in Britain, EU, and elsewhere, which is partly, I think, a response to some of these international concerns, particularly about China and its own recent restrictions of lithium export. these two raise the cost for everybody, not least for low-income people, of getting battery technology. And I'm wondering whether we think increasing extraction in the United States will improve matters much with respect to pricing ultimately if we don't do something about the trade restraints. I mean, after all, China, it develops most of the lithium in the world. It also produces most of the batteries, 86% or something of the batteries in the world. And so these things are all connected. I worry that sometimes we think that if we cracking down on globalization ultimately has positive effects. We just, as far as I know, it's an experiment, deglobalization. The other issue is about the climate justice parts. I mean, if you look at what California's done, right, there are climate justice provisions. I don't know how effective they are. In fact, climate justice provisions were required in the legislation for it to be enacted. It actually increased political support for the Global Warming Solutions Act and subsequent legislation in California to have climate justice provisions in the act. I know one or two of the states in RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, require that some substantial percentage of revenues from the auctions be spent, for example, improving sustainable housing in low-income neighborhoods and that kind of thing. So I'm wondering, and of course, state of Washington's own experiences where environmentalists doomed the first carbon tax, and then they got their way with the second and lost by a much bigger measure. Are we actually ignoring the costs of climate? I mean, it seems to me the lack of climate policy is evidence that we take the costs of climate policy too seriously, right? That this idea we might have an inefficient level of climate policy going from 0 to 1 is a huge problem to overcome.
So let me respond to both questions. I think the first issue you are raising is globalization and conflict. Climate change, I think it's a very important debate. Because in the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, they have put in 2 provisions on batteries and the pods. And at different years, it has to be either within North America or countries where America has free trade agreement. They don't want to say not China. So they've kind of worked around it. Of course, Europeans are mad, South Koreans are mad, and Japanese are mad because at this point in time, United States of America, except for Tesla, is importing all EVs. Tesla is the only indigenous manufacturer. And the kind of restrictions the IRA has imposed are very unrealistic. In fact, the president of Toyota 4 days ago has issued a statement. And he said California cannot simply meet its zero emission cars target. And we are not getting into the EVs. So they want to do hybrid and then straight away go to hydrogen. Because they don't think EVs, the way it is being formulated, is realistic. And even if we have the batteries, we'll not have the charging infrastructure. Because that's another inequity. Charging infrastructure is where people will actually charge. But if rich people are buying EVs, why would you put charging infrastructure in poor areas? So it becomes a vicious circle. You have poor, smaller number of charging infrastructures. People say, well, if I have an EV, I can't charge it. I live in an apartment. And if I park my car outside, it gets broken into. So now, even in Seattle, at night, people are keeping the windows open and put a sign on the windshield. There's nothing in the car, please don't break the window. That's the level of lawlessness. And I'm talking about good areas in Seattle. If you have to park on the street. So if you live in an apartment and you have to park on the street, it's a big problem. And God forbid, if you have to plug in electricity, it's inviting problems. So there are lots of issues. And and China is a big player. And you can't wish China away. They have at least 10 years head start. So if we want to go gung-ho or national security and say restrict China, are we willing to compromise on climate change? So Neves and I call it the John Kerry dilemma, because this is in COP, they're saying, what do you want? Do you want national security? Do you want climate? You can't have both. And the subsequent WTO challenge. So I don't think there's a good answer to this. And I don't think the Democrats themselves have a good answer to this. Both have their costs, and nobody wants to talk about costs. Everybody wants to talk about benefits. That's what the frustrating part is. Which comes to a second question. That are we putting up impossible hurdles? Because whenever you introduce a new policy, there will be costs. And eventually the costs are taken care of as the policy progresses, policy matures. And then I think that's an excellent argument. The problem is now equity is on the top agenda of everybody. So in this policy milieu, if you say, let equity take a back seat, it would be politically very difficult to build consensus. So EPA now has an Office of Equity. Every policy must have an equity focus, and rightly so, because policies have not thought about equity. You know, what we call conservation refugees. You create national parks, but you evict people who are living there. As if, that's, one of the Lynn's argument that people are not the enemies. These communities have lived in these forests for a very long period of time, try to understand, just don't evict them. So I think that's again a policy dilemma. That we want faster policy rollout, which means there will be mistakes. There's nothing called a perfect policy. And I think that's why I think Sania's point is probably a very good one. Not probably, it is a very good one. That maybe there's a procedural issue that we haven't talked about sufficiently. And maybe engaging people at different levels, not engaging with friends, friendly NGOs and an echo chamber, but actually going out and talking to people who disagree with you. These people would feel they have been consulted. And creating some mechanism of compensation. I don't think we are doing much beyond lip service. Everybody's now talking about, the blue-green alliance, we need just transition, and that's lovely. At least people are talking about it. But people are not doing much about it. And we try to press, Seattle city government, this government, okay, tell us what exactly are you doing? Oh, we have this competition, we've given money some NGOs. That's lovely. But who are these NGOs? What are they doing? How are they measuring impact? That's the question we want to ask. And are these NGOs your friends and cronies for that? And is the money really trickling down to local people? Or it's really in overheads and building new offices, so on and so forth. So these are the conversations we ought to have. And that's why I think the Ostrom workshop, given its legacy, is in a very good position to say, this has to be on the table. We can be pro-climate, pro-community, pro-agency, and pro-justice. They are actually in coherence. If we just try to think about in a slightly different theoretical framework.
Okay, so we're gonna do a lightning round because we got about 5 minutes left. And we still have about 4 people that have really great questions. So I think first it's Gustavo, then Shannon, then Brian, and then Wes, and then.
So I take all the questions then.
Yes.
Good, sure.
Okay.
So very fast. So typical answer, especially in economics, to problems of policies generating redistributive cost is essentially compensations. But in reality, we need to observe, don't we need like a bigger discussion of what's the political economy issue that blocks those compensations? And then the second thing, thinking about the American politics, has already been very complicated to push for pro-green and climate change policy, only focusing on efficiency. I think if you put on the table also equality, it's almost dead, the possibilities of a bipartisan move in that direction. So in that sense, I think taking too much emphasis on justice issues is essentially problematic from my perspective.
So 2 things. One, I like the focus on the idea of cost and benefits. I'm wondering if you have looked at where nexuses of charging stations or actual electric vehicles are, and see if that maybe has an impact, as well as if this is done during drought season, if the impact from climate change induced drought would maybe have an impact. Is that?
Oh, I think it was Brian next and then Brian, are you there? Can you,
Yes, good. I put a question in the chat, but given the time, I'll just say a comment that I think it could be promising, as you suggest, to draw on ideas about institutional artisanship, including, like you pointed out, the issue of kind of preemption. When does the higher level federal override lower, or when does the state override local communities, and collective action, how to come to agreement, including, kind of holdout questions, which are also going to affect issues of, okay, compensation, who, how much, what's fair, how is that all done? So thank you for an interesting talk.
and then Wes, you have the very last question and then we'll let Aseem respond.
Yeah, so my question is about distance and spatiality in your model. So I guess I would ask if you have tried out a spatial model to account for like the highly clusterized responses you have in your data. And additionally, I have a hard time interpreting the distance to Thacker Pass because it's really highly concentrated in what I assume are the two metro areas. And so you don't really have a clean gradient of distance. I mean, that's the Nevada population in a sense. But it also makes it hard to really assess the validity of that measure. So I was just wondering if you had some alternative strategies to that or thoughts.
May I?
Fire away.
Okay, excellent. So Thacker Pass, you're right. The population in Nevada is very spatially concentrated. And if you're in Vegas, you really don't think about Thacker Pass. That's why we took the mines. And maybe prior exposure to mine shapes perceptions about Thacker Pass. So hopefully we'll be able to replicate the study in some other areas where population is a bit more distributed. But I think your point is very well taken. And I'll add to that there is a physical distance and psychological distance. So people may be physically proximate to a mine, but psychologically they think it's away. Or people might be away and they think. So we also have to think about perceptions of distance as opposed to physical distance. And how is that affecting? So ask people, how far do you think you're from Thacker Pass? So, or the next iteration in some other paper. So Davis and I actually just finished a paper in South Africa, looking at just transition. And you're right, there are different ways to compensate, that we call it varieties of just transition. And one of the issues we face, so we are working with some scholars from Stellenbosch, and they decided to do qualitative 51 interviews. And for a variety of reasons, they said we can't simply do a survey experiment we had lengthy discussion, because getting into a community, if you have money, that creates different kinds of problems, getting access to people. So we had to tie up with the local NGO and, go just below the radar without making a lot of song and dance. And we asked people, okay, what kind of compensation? We had a semi-structured interview. And the problem there is very interesting. Most of the just transition funds are coming from this $8 billion that EU, US have announced. It's coming through foreign aid. But local people say, we don't want the government to be involved. We don't trust the government. There's so much of corruption. So the title of the paper is Just Transition in a Low Trust Economy. And nobody wants long-term. They said, I can't wait for long-term because they'll take the money away. Just give me all the money now. They don't want investment in reskilling. They don't want investment in local infrastructure because the trust in community and the government is very, very low. This is a low trust environment. South Africa has got the highest crime rate in the world. Situation might be different in other places. But I think you're right. Structuring compensation is a lot of challenge. It's easier for developed economies. We have a pension system. You can go through unions that still have some level of credibility in spite of all their problems. But in developing countries, where the organized sector is not that strong and level of politicization of unions is very high, you're right. There's a huge, huge challenge. And we've not even scratched the surface of the JT debate. At the moment, it's still at the level of slogan, but how to actually deliver it? Individual, community, long-term compensation, short-term compensation, you look at different dimensions. Nobody's talked about that. Should be structured as social welfare payment, as a pension system. Nobody wants to talk about it. So you're right. That's actually, I would say, the next generation of JT debate. So I'm out of time. I'll talk to you after this.
That's actually a great segue. We will have lunch here if folks would like to hang around. I believe it's Peely's Party Tacos, is my understanding. So it should be delicious and we'll.
Thank you, folks.
And you can, when the kitchen is where the food is, maybe come back out and we'll continue the conversation. Thanks again to everybody for joining us, and to Aseem and also Nibas for a wonderful paper and conversation.
Thank you.